All right, so we should get started, I suppose. We are jumping to, no, actually, falling backwards, I guess. We finished 14 last time, which was the last organic. We're now going backwards to 13, which is carbohydrates. Why they put that in between, I'm not really sure. And then we're going to kind of finish up here carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So after you go through these last chapters, especially this chapter, and then also probably the recorded lecture that I put up there that covers those last few chapters, again, whatever's in there is really what you're responsible for. So again, we may not cover everything that's in those chapters. And obviously this would be final material that we're talking about right now. All right, so we're going to talk about carbohydrates, and we're going to wave to each other. That's your left hand and your right hand as well. So we're going to talk about chiral molecules to begin with. And there's a reason why there is a hand, I suppose, there are two hands. So when we talk about chiral molecules or chiral compounds, they have the same number of atoms, but they are arranged differently in sort of space. Usually they will have one or more, especially sort of with carbohydrates, one or more is sometimes referred to as a chiral carbon. And the way that you could sort of recognize something as being a chiral carbon is that it typically will have four different groups attached. So when you look at that particular carbon, if it has four different things directly attached to that carbon, it would be considered a chiral carbon. Now, when we have a chiral compound, these are guys that have mirror images that do not superimpose on each other. So what that means is if you, I guess not really back in, but if you put a chiral compound up against the mirror and the reflected guy, if you take out the reflection from the mirror, you will not be able to properly superimpose it on each other correctly. And that's what the hand demonstration is. If you take this hand and put it in front of a mirror, you get this hand staring back at you, right? So if you take this hand out of the mirror, you do whatever you like to that hand. You can rotate it without breaking your hand or anything like that. You can get the thumbs to match, but I got palm up, palm down, so that's not right. You can flip it this way so that you got palm down on both, but thumbs on the wrong side. So a chiral compound will have a mirror image that will not be able to be superimposed, even if you sort of rotate it around and move it around. So again, if you just sort of grab out that mirror image, there will always be something that's just not right. So there'll always be like a connection that's not correct. There'll always be like an atom sort of out of place if you try to rotate it. And that's what a chiral compound is. A chiral compound, as we'll talk about, is something that actually does have a mirror image that will actually can be superimposed on something. And here's an example that if we take a mirror image here, and a chiral compound cannot be superimposed. So if we were to put this guy up against the mirror, again, we're going to get some reflection there. That's going to go there. That's going to go there. And then this guy's going to go in the back. Once again, if we were to grab out the mirror image and try to superimpose it on the original, you can see that the green and the orange don't really match up. And you may think to yourself, well, can I just like give it like a half a turn or something like that? And it won't rotate that way. So it's going to rotate properly, which means something will always be out of phase, even though you may be able to get say these guys line up, you may not be able to get the other ones to line up. So there's always going to be something that will be sort of out of phase. And that's different, as I mentioned, than an achiral compound. An achiral compound is one where when you do take sort of the mirror image out with sufficient perhaps rotation or something like that, you can get them to sit kind of perfectly on each other. And obviously, if a chiral compound is one where we have four different groups attached to the carbon, an achiral compound is one where you don't have four different groups. So you got at least one group in common. So for example, here our bromine, when we look at this guy in the middle, which is a carbon, we have two bromines there. So when we do pull out this mirror image, we simply could rotate them. And really it's because we have a couple of groups that are pretty much the same. That's going to allow it to kind of lock into place and sort of fit nicely on top of the original image. with some rotation. So as you can see, it fits on top of that image. So chiral compounds have mirror images that are non-superimposable. Achiral compounds will have mirror images that you can superimpose. We will see in carbohydrates, like I said, a lot of chiral carbons and some achiral carbons as well. But sometimes the chiral carbons kind of the important carbons that we look at. And you should also remember when we talk about here the carbohydrates that you can have more than one chiral carbon. So you don't just have one, perhaps you could, but you could have multiple chiral carbons, for example, in a compound. And depending on which one we look at, can be kind of important. So here are some chiral and achiral stuff. We got gloves, which are chiral, golf clubs, which are chiral, achiral soccer ball there, right-handed scissors. I'm not sure what happens with left-handed scissors, but we'll see. All right, so let's take a look at these. Take a moment. For each of these, are these chiral or achiral sort of compounds? All right, so let's take a look at these. So in this case, we really are going to probably be focusing in on the carbons here in the center. And again, what we are looking for is, in order for this, for example, to have a chiral carbon, we will need 4 different groups attached. So if we take a look at the first one, that chlorine is different than the hydrogen, which we could kind of consider a group in this case. Chlorine and hydrogen is also different than the methyl group, and that is also different than the ethyl group. So that would be 4 different groups that are attached to that carbon. This would be considered a chiral carbon, and it would also be considered a chiral compound because of that. That means that if we stuck that thing in front of a mirror and we took the mirror image, it would not superimpose on each other. So again, these guys would not superimpose on each other. Question on that one there. Looking at the next one here, we have a chlorine, different than a methyl, different than a hydrogen, but we got another hydrogen. So those are 2 groups that are definitely the same. So we definitely don't have 4 different groups on that carbon. So this would be a achiral carbon, and it would probably be an achiral compound as well. That means if we took B there up to the mirror, we can take its image out and rotate it around and be able to basically superimpose it on each other. Lastly here, we got a methyl, different than a chlorine, then a hydrogen, and a bromine. So that looks like 4 different groups. So that would be our chiral carbon there. And again, we would have a non-superimposable mirror image. So when we look at some of these carbohydrates a little bit later, that's sort of what you want to look at. And again, there will be multiple carbons to look at. And you just want to see, do they have kind of those 4 different groups attached? And then you'll be able to identify that as either a chiral carbon or an achiral carbon. Any questions on that there? All right, so hopefully they agree. So that's good. Now, sometimes we do see what is referred to as Fisher projections, and Fisher projections are used to draw sort of 3-dimensional into 2-dimensional. It places the most oxidized group up on top. In the case of the carbohydrates, pretty much as we will see, that's going to be like our carbonyl carbon that we saw in organic chemistry, carbon oxygen double bond, and that's usually towards the top. They use vertical lines in place of dashes for bonds that go backwards. So it's typically, you might sometimes see somebody draw a picture where they have kind of dash lines, and that implies it's kind of going behind the board or paper. They also use horizontal lines in place of wedges. So a very common way sometimes you might see some people draw things to demonstrate sort of 3-dimensional there is with a wedge, which means that it comes out of the paper. So here they use vertical lines for those kind of guys that go backwards, and again, horizontal lines to represent those guys kind of coming forward out of the paper. As we see here, we have our mirror images here. And again, if we look at this, once again, this is our carbonyl carbon, right? And that is the most oxidized group. We have our carbon in the middle, and once again, we do have our 4 different groups basically attached to that, which would make that a chiral carbon. And what about this carbon right here? Would that carbon there be chiral? So if we look at the guy at the bottom, which is CH2OH connected to a carbon, right? So this guy, basically, if we draw it out, has this, right? And we got this, and then we got, whatever that carbon group. So that's different, but those two are the same, yeah? So that's actually an achirocarbon. And the thing with carbohydrates, I won't say 100% of the time, but if you're looking for the last chirocarbon sort of from the oxidized group, I would say in a lot of cases, it's usually the one right before that guy. Yeah, is sort of where you can find kind of the last chirocarbon in a sort of carbohydrate. Again, not 100% of the time, but a good majority of the time, if you kind of just go to that carbon right before that guy at the bottom, that's going to be probably your last chirocarbon. That doesn't mean that there won't be other chirocarbons in the carbohydrate, but that's a lot of times where you can find that last chirocarbon, which is important, as we'll talk about here in just a second here. This is also very commonly how carbohydrates are written as well, kind of like line structure, if you will. So a lot of times carbohydrates are just written, there's other things attached like OHs, H's, CH2OH, a little bit of that sort of happening. And almost like line structure, everywhere sort of goes there. Those are all carbons. So in this particular one that I drew, again, we would have 1 carbon, 2 carbons, 3 carbons, 4 carbons, and 5 carbons in that particular one. So kind of like line structure where they kind of cross, is usually a carbon sitting there. And a lot of times they may not actually obviously write the carbon in there and stuff like that. So you want to make sure you don't miss the counting. Like this guy here, that would be 1 carbon, 2 carbons, and 3 carbons happening there. And in this case here, it is, as we can see, that carbon right above that guy is the chirocarbon there, with this guy not being a chirocarbon. And what about the very first carbon? Is that a chirocarbon here? This is actually not a chirocarbon because it only has 3 things attached, right? It doesn't have 4 things. It's got that, I guess, and it has this entire thing. So that would be considered only 3 things. And so that would not be considered a chirocarbon. So, and this compound, it would just have 1. Yeah. It wouldn't necessarily wouldn't be. The guy on the bottom would be, that would just be probably classified as, we'll talk about, it's really kind of like the functional group. So it's more like the most oxidized sort of carbon group, that carbonyl group. It would be classified more as a carbonyl carbon, kind of like what we saw in organic chemistry. Yeah. It is not. So it is not. So this guy here has only 1, 2, and this entire thing that I boxed would be considered the group that's sort of attached to it. So it only have 3 groups attached. So remember, for it to be sort of a chirocarbon, it needs to have 4 different groups attached. In this case, it's kind of missing a group in that sense. Yeah. So usually these guys, which look like functional groups, like we saw in organic chemistry, and they are, and that obviously is our aldehyde group, just like we saw in organic chemistry. Those guys are really more thought of as kind of like still functional groups and that type of thing, and they're not really chirocarbons or anything like that. Now, that brings us, speaking of chirocarbons, to also sometimes how we look at some of these carbohydrates as L or D sort of notations, as isomers as well. And by convention, the L sort of notation means that it is the guy that has the OH group on the left-hand side. So L and lefts makes sense, I suppose. But the OH group that we're actually looking at is the one that is the furthest from really your carbonyl group. So wherever your carbonyl group, which is usually on the top of these guys, we're looking for the carbon and the OH group. And that is, by the way, needs to be a chirocarbon. So we're looking for the last chirocarbon from the carbonyl group, or the most oxidized group up there. And whichever side the OH is on that particular carbon will give you either your D or your L. If it's on the right-hand side, it would be the D notation. And as we can see here, once again, this is really our sort of functional group there. And that is a chirocarbon, as it has one group, the OH2, 3, and 4 groups that are all different. And once again, as we just talked about, by that carbon is not obviously a chirocarbon, that's an achirocarbon. So since this is the last chirocarbon from the carbon-oxygen double bond, we see in this case that the OH group is on the left-hand side. So this would be sort of like the L isomer, if you will. Opposites over here, once again, the furthest carbon from that carbon-oxygen double bond is still this carbon. And in this case, our OH group is on the right-hand side, which would give us our D glyceraldehyde in this particular case. So when you're assigning L or D, or asked is it L or D, or if you're asked to draw something in, say, like the L or D sort of conformation, that is sort of what it means. It means that when you go as far as you can from the carbon-oxygen double bond and you find the farthest chirocarbon, on that chirocarbon, your OH group will either be on the left-hand side if it's L, or it'll be on the right-hand side if it's the D sort of isomer there. Any questions on that there? All right, so let's take a look at this here. Indicate whether each pair is a mirror image that cannot be superimposed. I feel like that's a double negative, but maybe. All right. So take a moment. So we're comparing this guy to this guy, this guy to this guy. And we want to know, I guess, or you could just try to figure out, can they be superimposed or not be superimposed? Is a better way, I guess, wording that question. These two, and you want to compare these two. So they're asking, can you superimpose? This is the mirror image for this guy. Can they be superimposed on each other or not, basically? And the same thing here. That's the original structure. That's the mirror. Can they be superimposed on each other? So to answer that question, really what we should look at is whether or not, right, there is a chirocarbon or not, right? Because we know if there is a chirocarbon, then our mirror image cannot be superimposed, right? And if there is not, then it can be. So if we take a look at our first one here, and again, our mirror would be right about there. And again, it would be sort of reflecting, if you will. And if we take a look at this carbon, I got a CH3, which is different than that guy. That's different. That's different. That does look like 4 different groups, which means that is a chirocarbon. And because of that, our mirror image, which would be this guy, cannot be superimposed. So to answer the question, yes, that cannot be superimposed. The kind of the double negative there. How about this one? This one, again, if we slap a mirror there, we come here, we see 2 hydrogens, right? Which tells us that that carbon is not going to be chiral. And clearly the only other carbon we got going on is that one, which obviously has 3 hydrogens on it. So that's definitely not going to be chiral either. So it cannot be a chiral compound because there is no chirocarbon involved. And that means that this is a achiral, which means you can superimpose your image, right? So to answer the question, this one would say yes, and this one would say no, because the question was which one cannot be superimposed. So the top one cannot be superimposed, bottom one can. Any questions on those 2 there? Yeah.
I understand the idea of we can and so can, like, I understand the visible. It seems like if we rotate it, one to the left, it will give us the same result.
It won't, because what we're looking at is, remember, this is just like a flat drawing. There's geometry, right? So like tetrahedral. So as you rotate, you're not rotating like just like a 90-degree flop, right? You got like 109.5, and it won't fit. It won't match up correctly because of that. So you have to remember that, although, and that's why sometimes when you think about mirror images, this really like a hard concept, because right, you look at it and go like, that looks like it's right. But what can happen in some cases is sometimes the bonds can sort of switch places in their sort of three-dimensional structure. And also this is, again, more of a, like a tetrahedral geometry around that carbon. So you have those different geometries happening that you got to think about. So it's not just like, I know what you're saying. You're like, hey, if I just take that thing and flop it, I'm good to go, right? But we got to remember that molecule, right? You can't necessarily just take it and flop it because of the different geometries that there are and the different angles that there are. So trust me when I say it can't happen. It will not happen because of those different geometries that's happening. Even though visually, when you look at it sort of flat, it just looks like, hey, can I just take it and just flop it over and we're going to be good? So the short answer is no, it won't be good because of those sort of geometries that are there. And that's why we're really looking at two-dimensional here, right? Not three-dimensional type thing. So, the best way you can sometimes kind of think about those mirror images is if you like build models and then you like take the model and rotate and you'll be able to see because of the geometries that, things just don't line up even if you kind of rotate it and stuff like that. Other questions? So carbohydrates, which is obviously the main part of this chapter, or it's the only part of the chapter, I think, are our major source of energy. Carbohydrates contain three elements, carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. They are sometimes called sugar. We take carbohydrates, right, and sugars, and we use them for energy, and then we also store them, right, for fuel later. We go through a little glycolysis, right, and then a little gluconeogenesis. We got to break it back down and do all that fun stuff. Or as some of you prepared earlier today, I heard, by having some pasta and maybe some bread and some potatoes here as you're studying for class here today. So let's talk a little bit about carbohydrates. They are produced through photosynthesis, such as glucose in plants from CO2 and H2O through respiration. So we get some energy from the sun, a little photosynthesis, creates some carbohydrates, and obviously this kind of cycle of water and CO2 and this respiration cycle that involves energy coming in as well. Now, when we talk about carbohydrates, there's a few different types of carbohydrates that we're going to talk about. There are monosaccharides, and much like the name implies, mono means one, so they come as ones basically. And those are the simplest sort of carbohydrates or sugars that you could have. There's also disaccharides, and disaccharides are basically when you take those monosaccharides and basically put them together. Surprisingly enough, as a lot of things that we've sort of seen, to put them together, as we will talk about, we basically kind of just take water out, and you take water out, and they're able to kind of come together and make these disaccharides. These are things, as we will see, like sucrose, lactose, and those type of sugars. Polysaccharides, they contain just a big old bunch of repeatable sort of units. So for example, see towards the end of the chapter, take a bunch of just glucose units and just stack them all together. You get these polysaccharides like we find in like glycogen and stuff like that. If you have these type of sugars, as we'll talk a little bit about as we go through the chapter, since they are monosaccharides to start with, you can't really add water to kind of break it apart into anything less than that. When you have a disaccharide, as I mentioned before, we make it by taking water out. So if you throw some water in there, you will break apart your disaccharide into the monosaccharides and make it up. And obviously you would need a lot of waters to break apart each of those sort of sugars there into individual sort of units. So let's start with the monosaccharides, and monosaccharides usually consist of 3 to 6 carbons. They have that carbonyl group, so it is the exact same thing and group that we talked about there in organic chemistry. That's our carbonyl group. And this is also sometimes referred to as a carbonyl carbon. It is still our polar guy, with that being more negative and that being more positive. Now, pretty much these monosaccharides will have also one of two organic functional groups that we've solved before. They will have our aldehyde group, and a reminder, right, our aldehyde group, carbon, oxygen, double bond with our hydrogen. And they will also have perhaps our ketone group, which is our 3 carbon group in a row. So these kind of carbohydrates and these sugars, will also have these sort of organic functional groups on it. And the ones that we'll look at here will have one of those two, basically either the aldehyde group or the ketone group. They will also have several OH groups on it. And as you might remember, we talked a little bit about sugar and like sucrose, for example, and it is very soluble in water because it contains a lot of OH groups. So all those OH groups, for example, right, gives it the ability, for example, to hydrogen bond with water and interact well with water when you talk something like sugar and just general sugar like sucrose. So let's take a look at the first type of classification of a monosaccharide, and these are aldoses. And aldoses will have the aldehyde group up on top. So this is how you know it's an aldose because it has an aldehyde group. So pretty much an easy way to remember that is like aldehyde is A, right? And aldose is A. So that is how you know which group you should have on that. It will also have a number of carbons that are there. And we could also classify our monosaccharides based on how many carbons there are. So if there are 3 carbons, it's a triose. If there are 4 carbons, it's a tetrose, like tetra we talked about. 5 carbons is like penta, like a pentose. 6 carbons is like hexane or hexa or hexose here. And in this particular case, we would look at it and it has 1, 2, 3, and 4 carbons. So this would be an aldose, and that is also a tetrose because it has 4 carbons. By the way, this is how many chirocarbons does this one have? Or does it have any chirocarbons? It has, I'm going to go with 2 chirocarbons. I don't know. What else? Got no chemistry or something? I mean, yes. Yeah, so let's take a look at these carbons and see which ones are chirocarbons and which ones are not. Clearly, the top guy is our functional group, so we're not going to really even worry about that. So we're going to hit the second one there. And when we look at the second carbon, which is right here, when we look at it, it actually does have 4 different groups attached, and you may not see it, but let me put some boxes around it. It has this group right here, which is definitely different than that hydrogen, right? And it's definitely different than that OH. And the last group is actually everything below it, which is different than what's above it to the left or to the right of it. So that one does actually have 4 different groups attached. And that is considered a chirocarbon there in green. Any questions on that one? Now, if I go to the carbon below it, we'll go with that color. Why not? So if we go with that carbon there, get rid of my boxes here. And if we're looking at what is attached to that carbon, we're going to go with got an OH group, which is different than this guy, and different than this guy, and different than all that together as considered a group hanging off of it, right? So there is 2 chirocarbons, one green and one purplish, I suppose there. As we also talked about, this carbon here is a chiral. One at the bottom, it's not. Again, it still has the 2 hydrogens, so it is not chiral. So this compound has 2 chirocarbons. It also has 1 achirocarbon on the bottom, right? And now the double jeopardy question is it a L or a D? This L or D? It is D, yes. So we want to go from our carbon oxygen double bond to the last chirocarbon furthest away from it, which is why we kind of identify which one's which, right? As I mentioned before, also kind of like right above that guy, usually in most cases. And we can see our OH group here is on the right-hand side. So there we have our D happening here. Yeah. Any questions on that there? Yeah.
It'd be like both, like D and an L, like the OH on top, like on the left. Well, that's the main display.
No, so if your question is if like the green guy there, it was on the left and that one was on the right. Would it be both? No, because where you assign L and D is always the very last chirocarbon from that carbon oxygen double bond. So it has to be looking at the very last chirocarbon, which in this case is this one right here, from where this group is at. So you don't do it for each chirocarbon that's present. It has to be the one that is furthest away from that carbonyl carbon, basically, is where you assign it. So, you know, if you kind of had you wouldn't probably have an ROH group in most cases there, but that's where you would assign it in our case. Yeah. Yeah.
There were like carbon groups connected to this chain, or would we still count it as count like tetrals, pentos?
Yeah, so I would say most of your carbohydrates won't have a lot of extra stuff hanging off every way, you know, attached to it. So it'll all sort of be attached together, carbons to carbons to carbons straight down. And if you had more carbons, then obviously, you know, it would maybe be like a hexose or something like that. But you know, you wouldn't have, I guess, if your question is like in organic chemistry where you have branches coming off the main part of it and stuff like that, you really won't come across that with carbohydrates. At least not for sure in this class. Yeah. Other questions? And obviously, to answer your question as well as, you know, what would happen if I threw an OH on that guy here? Would that be a L or D? Would that be both? What did I just do by putting the OH on the other side? I just made that carbon now a chiral, right? So you can't have both. So that's why we look at the chirocarbon that's furthest away and furthest away from always the carbon oxygen double bond. It's that carbonyl carbon, because that's really the it's the one that gets sort of oxidized. It's kind of the reactive part, kind of like an organic chemistry in a sense, right? Where we everything sort of happens at the functional group. So it's kind of the same idea. That's kind of like the important part of this. A lot of what would happen as this thing, for example, as we'll talk about, kind of closes in and it makes a ring structure, for example, and opens up. It all kind of happens at that kind of functional group. It's kind of like in organic chemistry. A lot of the reactions happen at that like functional group part. So that's kind of the important part. So you could always kind of think of it as, although we don't necessarily number the carbons, always still like, you know, kind of the important one, the carbon number one. And when we're looking for that chirocarbon, it's always got to be the furthest one away from it. Yeah. Other questions on that? Yeah.
So when working group the carbon and bonded to the double bonded carbon and everything attached to that second carbon together, that's going to be one.
Yeah. So when we talk about groups, right, on something like a carbon, right, we're talking about whatever is sort of directly attached to the carbon, right? So in this case, you know, we kind of pick up a lot of stuff as say when we go to like this carbon here, right? We pick up all that because this carbon is directly attached to it. It also has all the other stuff attached, which now all becomes like one big group, basically. And that's why we kind of box it all together because we're looking at what's directly attached to that carbon. And that even though that carbon that's attached to it, it now has a bunch of other stuff attached to it. So it just all becomes kind of like one big group when we're analyzing that carbon for chirality. Yeah. Other questions? All right, then obviously we have our aldehyde group and we got to have our other favorite organic group, which is our ketone group. And our ketone group is still the same organic group that we talked about there, our 3-carbon run with, again, our carbon oxygen double bond. Our carbonyl carbon has to be in the middle. Now, I should back up for just a second and take a look at the one we just looked at for a second here. And I should also erase all my scribble on it, I suppose. There we go. Now, just like what we talked about in organic chemistry, right? When we have the aldehyde group, it should always be where in the compound at the end. And that's the same idea here. It is always going to be when you have an aldose or the aldehyde group in your carbohydrate, is definitely that carbon oxygen double bond is always going to be at the end for the same reason, right? We still have that hydrogen. Now, just like we talked about with ketones, you'll never have the carbon oxygen double bond at the end, right? Because you need that 3-carbon run. And it's the same thing here with the carbohydrates. So when you have a ketose, which is a ketone group attached to your carbohydrate, you will have that 3-carbon run, which means your important sort of group is always going to be at least second in there. And it's not going to be at the end, because just like we talked about in organic chemistry, this is basically your ketone group right there, that you need that 3-carbon run with the oxygen double bond in the middle. Now, we would call this a ketose because, again, we see the ketone group there. And by the way, sort of in that line structure for the way that sometimes people will draw it, they'll sometimes draw it like this. And again, they'll just kind of lay that up there and then continue on, with the rest of it. So you got to remember, again, there is a carbon there, and that's sometimes how they're sort of drawn. And we could also identify by the number of carbons that are here as a triose, tetrose, or pentose. In this particular case, it is a ketohexose. A ketohexose, keto meaning it has the ketone group, hexose meaning it has 6 carbons, and again, including the one up here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 carbons that are here. All right, so the question is, how many chirocarbons are in this guy? I feel like you're just screaming numbers now, like it's like an auction. 3, 4, 5. I'll take 6. All right, let's start up here. Cairo. Is that Cairo? It is not, right? It's the same as the guy on the bottom, right? It's got 2 hydrogens. So we'll go achiral on that one, right? We're gonna not worry about, again, it's got the 2 hydrogens. We're not gonna worry about our functional group. Just skip it. Don't worry about it. We'll come to this guy. Chiral, achiral, no chiralness. It is chiral. Yeah, this one is, because it's got that group, right? It's got this group, and that group. Yeah, so that's all going to make it chiralness. If we then go to the next carbon, so we got that guy. So we go to this carbon, is it chiral? It is. It's got now that giant group, right? It's got this guy, and that happening, right? So there's 2 so far. We're making progress here. All right, so we got 2 happening here. And what about the third one there? That is, again, going to be chiral as well. And our guy at the bottom will be achiral, right? So we actually have 2 achiral carbons and 3 chiral carbons. Any questions on that? And by the way, the bottom one here, or the second to last one, 1 group, 2 groups, 3 groups, and 4 groups. Yeah, I got that really happening there. All right, so we got 3 chiral carbons there, which is good to know. I would say most of the time you'll probably see it written like this vertical way. That's probably very commonly the way that you would see it. Yeah. So we have these 3 chirocarbons, and this would be, you said DL, it would be D, right? As again, we're looking at the last chirocarbon actually from this guy, right? So we're looking for the very last one here. By the way, that is our friend fructose. Put a star on it, you should be able to recognize fructose. We'll see it again coming up in a bit, but perhaps for the final, be able to recognize fructose. Yeah. All right. So any questions on that there? All right. So we want to know, are these an aldo? Is it keto, tetrose, pentose, hexose? Take a moment, identify each of them. Also identify how many. Okay, so let's take a look and see. So we'll take a look at the A. Hopefully you should be able to recognize this organic group. That definitely looks like an aldehyde, and that means that this would be an aldose or an aldo. We could also count our carbons, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 in this case, and that would make it a hexose. And pyrocarbonness, how many we got? This right here is a chirocarbon, yeah. This one is a chirocarbon. This one is. 4, I guess. Yeah, good. Yeah, I think. Any questions on that there? All right, looking at the next one here, we got, hopefully you can see it here, a little 3 carbons in a row with our carbonyl happening there. So that's going to be our ketone group, just like we saw in organic chemistry. So that's going to definitely tell us this is a ketose or a keto. And in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which means this is going to be a pentose. And in this particular case, we have 2 chirocarbons. I'll spit that out, I think. So right there and right about there, I think, right? Yeah, both would be D in this case, right? As our farthest chirocarbon, the OH group would be on the right. Any questions on those identifications there?
Aldo, the keto would be correct
I'm sorry?
when you're ready. Aldo.
Yeah, we're not gonna necessarily name it, but for example, like we kind of saw on the previous page, somebody might call this an aldo hexose, implying that it's an aldehyde with the hexose. And this one might be called a keto pentose. That's not necessarily the name of the sugar, but that's just sort of how you might classify it. Other questions? Yeah. All right. So there you go. All right, so let's take a little bit of look at the structures of our monosaccharides. As we just talked about, we do place the most oxidized group towards the top, and that's going to be, in our case, either the aldehyde group, which will go up there on top, or our ketone group, which will have that 3 carbons on the top, with the second carbon having the oxygen double bond. We show chirocarbons as intersections of vertical lines. And again, as I mentioned before, there are carbons there. So don't forget to count them if you needed to count them for some reason. And there we go. There's our D and our L, I think, as we just saw there. So let's take a look at this slide, and you should put a star in this slide. You should be able to recognize these structures. You might not be asked to draw them for the final, but if they're given to you, be able to recognize them as glucose, ribose, and galactose. So just put a little star maybe next to this one is a good one. This is glucose there, and glucose is our 6 carbons. And again, we got our chirocarbons happening here, 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 and here. Once again, that's going to be D, as that is the furthest away from that group. This is ribose, which is a 5 carbon, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. It has 3 chirocarbons there. And again, also a D, because we have that OH group there on the right-hand side in the furthest chirocarbon. And this is galactose, which has 6 as well. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 carbons. And once again, this being our last chirocarbon, OH group there on the left. As you can kind of see here, as I mentioned earlier, well, again, not 100% of the time, but pretty close. And if you just kind of back it up from that bottom guy there, a lot of times that is going to be your last chirocarbon. And like I said, not 100% of the time, but pretty close. For our purposes here, you can probably find that chirocarbon really quickly, that last chirocarbon at least. So you do need to, again, if these structures are sort of given to you, be able to recognize them. Yes, yes.
Always the same. So like glucose on the 3rd carbon, like, or 2nd carbon away from the functional group, like the OH and H were like the same as everyone else, would it still be glucose or?
Yeah, so if it is glucose, it will have that arrangement of where the OHs are and the H's are. The only difference that would be a difference is if you had, say, L-glucose, the last OH would just be flipped. But all the other ones would be in the same location if it is glucose. If it's some are different, then might be something of a different sugar. Kind of like what we got going over here, you know, this guy's got the OH over here on the second one to the left and the right. So that's what the sort of galactose arrangement. What's up?
That was my question.
Yeah.
The OH and the H, they just pointed at. Yeah.
Oh, if you just flipped it, would it be the same thing? Is that what you're asking?
Not the entire thing, just the OH.
Just these two, just flip these two? Yeah. It would not be the same. It wouldn't be galactose. So in that sense. So I think your question, so the answer to your question, the ones before the last chirocarbon, yeah, they has to be kind of locked into that side, left, right, you know, whichever side it is. The only one that really can vary and still kind of make it the same sort of sugar is the last one on the last chirocarbon, and that would just give it like an isomer that it's like, you know, the L or the D version of it, depending on that. But the other ones, for example, if you want glucose, you know, you should have the OH there, and there on the other ones for it to be glucose. So if you just moved one over here, that wouldn't be sort of the correct orientation, you know, for it to still be glucose. Other questions on that? All right, so take a second. Are these D's, L's? What we got going on here? Okay, so let's take a look again on the first one. That would be chiral. That would be chiral, and that would be chiral. So we're going to look at the last chiral, and here's on the left. So that's going to be L in this case. Our guy in the middle, that's going to be chiral, and that will be chiral. And once again, on this one, we also have it on the left. And this would be chiral, this would be chiral, and that would be chiral. And here we have it on the right. I was going to put R, but I'll go with T. It seems right in that case. This is a keto, right? That's an aldo, and that's an aldo. And the first guy's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's a pentose. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's a tetrose. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that's a hexose there on each of those. Any questions on any of that identification there? All right. All right, so let's talk a little bit about glucose. Glucose or D-glucose is found in fruits, corn syrup, and honey. As we saw, it is an aldohexose. It's got the formula C6H12O6. It is what is known as blood sugar, right? Again, we use it in the body for fuel through glycolysis. We also do sort of store it as well in our body as well and break it back down if we need it, store it as glycogen. It is also the monosaccharide of polymers like starch, cellulose, and as I just mentioned, kind of where we store it as glycogen, and we go through gluconeogenesis to break that back apart and use it for energy if necessary. Now you can measure your blood glucose levels, and obviously if you have normal glucose levels or sugar levels, or you can be hyperglycemic, which hyper means more than, right, the normal sort of level. Or you could be hypoglycemic, which means you have lower blood sugar level. You can take a test for that, and usually they have you perhaps not eat something before you take that test, right? Because if you scarf down a cookie right before that test, you might find yourself up in that range or something like that. So you usually want to kind of fast to get a really good reading as to where your blood glucose levels are. So glucose, you need to know, this was the other one that was on that table that we saw or that figure. Fructose, you do need to be able to recognize. And again, fructose, as we saw, is a keto, and it is found in fruit juices and honey. In the body, it will convert to glucose. And again, it is also a hexose, but again, it has the ketone group versus the aldehyde group that we see there in glucose. Galactose, which is the other one as well that you need, is also a aldose and also a hexose. It is not found free in nature. It's obtained from lactose, which is a disaccharide. It has a similar structure to glucose, except on carbon number 4. And again, sort of to your question, with that being swapped out to a different sort of location, it becomes something else, like say galactose or something like that, versus say glucose. And we would count our carbons like we would do in organic chemistry. Again, that carbon oxygen double bond, kind of like the functional group, gets the lowest numbering, and we just number the carbons kind of like you would do if you had an aldehyde or a ketone, in terms of numbering those guys. So that would be carbon number 4 right there. That would be carbon number 5, and that would be carbon number 6 in this case, if you were going to number them. All right, so if we take a look at this here, that is our fructose there, I think. All right, we're going to pick back up here, I think. And any questions on anything we talked about so far? So obviously, like I said before, in this chapter, whatever we kind of cover, you're responsible for. So, when I say you should know those structures, perhaps it might show up somewhere on a final. Yes, know how those. All right. So we've talked about monosaccharides, and we're going to talk about how they sort of become cyclic type structures, which they can become cyclic structures. And we're going to talk about how to draw them from sort of like the straight chain there, if you will, to when it closes in on itself and makes these sort of cyclic rings. As we will see, these guys can, in certain cases, they could kind of like open up and close and open up and close these sort of ring structures, especially in the presence, say, of water or something like that. It could kind of open, shut, and open. So let's talk about really the two main sort of rings that we see when we are dealing with cyclic carbohydrates. And they're really also, you could kind of think of them like our organic sort of rings, kind of like our cyclohexane and our cyclopentane ring, except that they are missing a carbon because they actually have a oxygen that has been inserted inside. So these are, again, when we think about like our cyclohexane type of ring, that's what it looks like. And again, our cyclopentane ring here. And once again, the difference is, though, we do have an oxygen gets incorporated into the ring here. And the oxygen gets incorporated into the ring as they close in on each other. And we'll end up with really actually a 5-member ring or a 4-carbon member ring. So although they are based off of sort of cyclohexane and cyclopentane, as we'll talk about here, as they kind of close in on each other, one of the oxygens sort of gets incorporated into the ring. So we don't end up with a full kind of 6-carbon and 5-carbon ring. We actually end up with a 5-carbon and a 4-carbon ring. And these, I would say, would be the two sort of prevalent sort of rings that we see when these sort of monosaccharides sort of close up in a cyclic type structure. Now, in most cases, it's usually the sort of last chiral carbon, but a lot of times it's carbon number 5. We'll always sort of go find the carbonyl carbon. So you'll have that carbonyl carbon, which is our carbon oxygen double bond, either in the form of the aldehyde group or in the form of the ketone group. And down the road, say at like carbon number 5, for example, in a hexose, that is where sort of the attack is going to sort of happen. And that's where the ring is going to sort of close in on each other, is they're going to come together and close in. The result of that is, depending on sort of the group that you have up there, like I said before, that is where we're going to get this sort of incorporation of those oxygens that will come into the ring. So if we want to look at sort of the steps that we could follow for drawing these guys, we will get a cyclic hemiacetals. So if you remember, we talked about hemiacetals. We also talked about hemiketals. Remember, a hemiacetal is a carbon that has an OH group, right? Has a hydrogen, and it has like an oxygen carbon type of group happening. And remember that a hemi-ketal is this kind of the same thing. It's got the OH group, it's got a oxygen carbon group, but it does not have that extra sort of hydrogen because it's based off of a ketone. So when these guys sort of come together in this cyclic type structure, they do make these cyclic hemiacetals, and the carbon oxygen group and the OH group are part of the same molecule. For hexoses, it is the OH group at carbon number 5 that reacts with the aldehyde group are the ketone group. The cyclic structure of D isomer, the last CH2OH always ends up above the ring. So this is, for example, that last carbon group there, carbon number 6, for example. And what happens is when we have, say, carbon number 5, that OH group, and that carbon oxygen group, say here at the top, when they come together, they will close in on the ring, and this hydrogen here actually will do a little slide over action and actually will make that an OH group. And then this oxygen here will then get kind of incorporated into the ring. And that's how, again, we get sort of that oxygen that gets kind of popped into that ring. And that's how we get this guy that becomes like an OH group. And now we have kind of our hemiacetal, we have our OH group, our H, our oxygen carbon group happening there. And that's what our cyclic hemiacetal looks like. So that is, again, how this guy gets sort of incorporated into that ring. Not drawn here is there probably an OH somewhere here. And once again, we will have an H. So HOH, that's a carbon, and that carbon oxygen, oxygen carbon group there. And that makes our hemiacetal that's happening there. All right, so let's take a look here. I'm gonna just draw one. We'll go here and do it. And we'll talk about how we can kind of put it into a ring. So let's just say we had this here. I'll just make something up here. We'll go this way. Yeah, we'll go this way. We'll go this way. We'll go this way. All right, so let's just say we have this monosaccharide, and we wanted to basically turn this into sort of a cyclic carbohydrate. So really the first thing that you might want to do is just number our carbons. And once again, we are like an organic going to start up here with our kind of functional group as carbon number 1. Remember where they intersect is a carbon. So that's carbon 2, carbon 3, carbon 4, carbon 5, and carbon number 6. Okay. So one of the first things you could actually do, if you would like, is you could take the structure as it's standing upwards and frankly just drop it on its side. Just kind of take the structure and just drop it on its side. So if you take this guy and just kind of tip it over, you will end up with something that looks like this. And again, this would be carbon 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 happening there. Now, when I take the structure that I just drew and kind of tip it on its side to the right, everybody on the right-hand side will end up down, right? Because it just fell over. So everybody that's on the right-hand side will basically fall down. That means over here, I will have an OH. Over here, I will have an OH. I will have an H, and I'll have an OH. Everybody that's on the left-hand side of my original structure will basically end up, right? So again, as it drops down, everybody on the left will be pointing upwards, and we will have our H, our OH, our H, and our H. Any questions on that? So again, I just basically took my structure, just dropped it on the side. And if you don't want to have to drop on the side in the future, you can remember right, down, left, up, right? So that's a way you can kind of remember it. All right, so in this case, since this is an aldo hexose, we are going to get some combination occurring here at carbon number 5 is going to attack, if you will, carbon number 1, or where the carbon oxygen double bond is at. So this right here is really important to know, frankly, what ring I should draw. So remember, you pretty much have two options. You have that kind of 5-member ring, which kind of looks like cyclohexane. You have that 4-member ring that looks like cyclopentane. How do I know how many carbons my guy should have? Frankly, you just count how many carbons are between what you just did. So that's 1 carbon, that's 2 carbons, that's 3 carbons, that's 4 carbons, that is 5 carbons. So that tells me that the ring I should draw is that 5-member ring. And again, that 5-member ring is the one that kind of looks like cyclohexane. But again, we do have the oxygen incorporated inside. So again, that is how I could determine how many carbons I need and the proper ring. Once again, what I was talking about earlier is essentially when these guys come and close in, what's actually going to happen is, get rid of this arrow here. You're going to actually see this hydrogen basically, as we kind of go this way, slip up to here, and that's going to create an OH group there, and that's going to give us our carbon, oxygen, carbon, carbon, oxygen, carbon type situation that's happening there. And that's what's going to make our hemiacetal in this sort of form. So before I littered it there, let me unlitter it so we can kind of see what we had going on there first. Okay, so let me put my O back there. All right. Now, what we saw is if you draw it like this, there is definitely this guy here, carbon number 6, which is not part of the ring, right? It's outside of what's closing in. So where carbon number 6 and that guy that kind of falls outside of the ring always ends up is he will always end up here. So always end up upper left there of the oxygen in the ring, and that is carbon number 6, which is this guy right here, this guy right there. That group right there ends up always to the left of the oxygen. Now we're going to actually number our ring, and we're going to number our ring counterclockwise, which means we're going to roll this way. This is going to be carbon number 5. That's going to be carbon number 4, 3, 2, and 1. So we're going to come down 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, sort of counterclockwise there. Now what is left is, frankly, we're just going to put our OHs on there and we'll be done. So we obviously put in number 6. Number 5, we really want to skip because, frankly, that's what all came together to close the ring and the oxygen and all that. So we want to go to our next carbon, which is carbon number 4. And because my guy's on his side there, I can see the OH group is up or down? Up. So I draw a line and put my OH group up. Now I go to the next one, which is carbon number 3. My OH group is down. So I draw a line and put my OH group down. Yeah. Carbon number 2, my OH group is down. So I draw a line and put my OH group there. By the way, on the other end of the line is the hydrogen. A lot of times for simplicity, it doesn't get so crowded. They don't kind of put the hydrogens in there. But that is what's happening there. Yeah.
Why don't the hydrogen in or out?
Why do you not put, sorry again?
Yeah, over there, like number 4, we put it up.
Yeah.
Number 3 work. Like my question is, why didn't we put it in the cycle?
Why did it get, why is it not incorporated into the ring? Is that what you're asking?
No, why not? Why put it down, not up towards the inside?
It's because by doing this orientation, when we dropped it on the side, we will get the proper orientation of where those OH groups will end up. So we're actually just counting here. So at number 4, we can see our OH group is up. And by actually just simply dropping it on the side, when it closes up in a ring structure, that will give the OH sort of the correct orientation of where it should be. It will be number 4 would be up. It would be considered up, and it'll be on the outside. If you if you had like the third or second carbon and it was up, you could draw the OH up. It would just be in that orientation. It would look exactly like that, except that the OH would be up here. I put my finger here, but it didn't really close it off there, did it? But if it was up in this case, which is not obviously, but it would look just like that. Yeah. Yeah, so that's why we kind of did that first step of dropping it on the side to know if it should be kind of oriented up or down within the ring. Because it's 4, it's at the edge there, it will be kind of off the ring, it won't be in the ring. But if you did have an up one kind of in the kind of third or second position, you would draw it kind of going into the ring.
Number 3, number 2, and number 3, they're the same. And
They are the same.
Yeah, okay.
They are done, yes.
Well, number 4, that's supposed to be up. My question is, why is it not towards the inside?
Yeah, this is so it's drawn kind of two-dimensionally, if you will. Yeah, so you have the ring, which is sort of flat, and there's technically, three-dimensionally, it'll be like up or above the ring or below the ring. But two-dimensionally, it's hard to do that without wedges. So I think that's your question. I think you're asking. So, you have kind of the ring, right? It's kind of like when you have the cis or trans double bond, right? So you're up above the double bond or below it, but you would have the ring in that case. And three-dimensionally, it would be something like that. Yeah. Yeah. Again, the same thing with the flatness, of flipping it. But yeah, so in this case, this is the way you could draw it. And the up would imply that it's like above, kind of above the ring, if you will. Yeah. All right. So that leaves us carbon number 1, which is where things come together. And carbon number 1 will be based on what you are perhaps asked to draw. So I'm just going to redraw another one that looks exactly like what we just drew, so we can see the difference here. So we got this guy. We got this guy. We got this guy here. We got this guy here. Now at carbon number 1, we could have the OH group pointing downward, or we could have the OH group pointing upwards. And it depends on what is sometimes referred to as the anomer that you're asked to draw. Going down would be what is known as the alpha anomer, where you put that last OH group down. Going up would be known as the beta anomer, where you would put the last OH going upwards. So if you were asked to draw this, which you might be asked to draw this, by the way, it would ask you to draw either the alpha or the beta one, and that's how you would know, should you put that last one up or should you put that last one down? That's carbon number 1, yes. Yeah, so they will tell you when they ask you to draw it, to draw either the alpha or the beta anomer of it. So if they tell you to draw the alpha, you should put that last OH group down. And if they tell you to draw the beta, you should put the last OH group up. So they'll actually tell you. They'll tell you, yeah. So they'll say, draw this as a cyclic, alpha, whatever, or beta. So they'll give you that piece of information. Kind of like if you go backwards, which we'll talk about, if you were to take this out of the ring structure and kind of put it back the other way, they'll tell you, hey, draw D or L. So you know kind of where to put that last OH, at carbon number 5, for example. Question on that there. Yeah. Yeah.
For the double bond oxygen that breaks and turns to a hydrogen. It gets its hydrogen from number 5, right?
It does, yeah.
It picks up the OH, right?
Yes. Yeah. So what happens if we just kind of look at the in a simplistic way of what happens, a lot more to it than what I'm going to explain, but that's carbon, say number 5 here, and then obviously we have carbon number 1 that's happening there. So what happens is ultimately the change that occurs is this hydrogen basically will shift over there to the oxygen. And the result of that is it will turn this double bond into a single bond and drop your H in there. The result of that original number 5 losing the hydrogen is, I'll use the little thing, it kind of becomes negatively charged. And what that's going to allow it to be attracted to our carbon, which is positively charged. and that's how they kind of close in that ring. And that's how we get our hemiacetal that we were talking about here. Remember that there is a hydrogen here, right? So if we look at this carbon, which is carbon number 1, where the ring basically closed in, that has the OH group, right, which is part of our hemiacetal. It has the hydrogen, and this kind of going backwards this way is like that oxygen carbon containing group, which came from basically carbon number 5 as it came in there. And that's what makes that cyclic hemiacetal as it kind of comes together in that case. But ultimately what's happening is that hydrogen on that OH on number 5 is going to shift over basically to the carbonyl oxygen and make an OH group there. And then that's going to allow that oxygen on number 5 to be really attracted to the carbon. And that's what's going to sort of initiate the closing of the ring on each other. Other questions? All right. So why don't you try one, since, you know, I had all the sort of fun-ish maybe. Why don't we do, why don't we just, I don't know. Hey, why don't we do this one? Just make up something. Maybe it exists. Maybe it doesn't. Who knows? We'll see. We'll do actually not, let's just do this one first, actually. Let's do this one. We'll do this one first. All right, change my mind. We'll do this one first. And why don't you draw here? Why don't you draw the beta anomer? All right, close that thing up, draw it in the beta form. Okay, so let's take a look. Again, I'm going to number. So we're going to start with 1 up here, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Again, if you would like to drop it on the side, you can, and that would give us something that looks something like this. And this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Obviously, again, when we drop it to the right, everybody on the right-hand side ends up down. Everybody on the left-hand side ends up up. Or if you don't want to drop it, you can just remember that as well and not have to redraw it again by dropping it over. And if we do that, that means we got like an H, an OH, an OH, an OH, H, OH here. All right, at this point, once again, in this sort of hexose, and by the way, it's usually, if it's not a hexose, usually that last chirocarbon is where that's going to probably go attack. We'll go with number 5 here, going to go find our 1. So once again, in terms of what type of ring we should draw, that's 1 carbon, 2 carbons, 3 carbons, 4 carbons, and again, 5 carbons. So we should again go with our 5-member ring, which looks like cyclohexane with the oxygen incorporated inside. As we've talked about there previously, our number 6 guy here is always going to be sort of outside of that, which means we will go up on top. And again, always to the left of the oxygen that's in the ring. That gives you the orientation of that's number 6. Again, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Once again, we're going to skip number 5 as that's where everybody came to close in on the ring. Number 4, our OH is down, so we're going to draw a line going down. Number 3, the OH is down. Number 2, the OH is up. And lastly, here we want beta, which means my last OH should go down or up. Should go up, yeah. So it should go something like that. Yeah. Any questions on that one there?
No matter how we look like to the right or to the left, when it says the beta animal, we could just put it up as the question asks, right? So if it's
Yeah.
all, hydrogens on like 2 and 3, 4 were opposite, doesn't matter, right?
It doesn't matter. So the beta really is only for like that last carbon number 1 as to where it should go.
That is something that we've been depending on, like the question, right? Like if it says beta, you just
Yeah, the question will tell you, like I said, they draw either the beta or the alpha, and that basically is what you would use for carbon number 1 in the ring. Everybody else should be based off the original sort of structure, kind of when you drop it on a side, or Again, if you don't want to drop it, you could just do the left and right, and no right again down and left up, basically, and you'll be in business. Question on that one? All right, one more here. Now we'll do this one here. So I was thinking about, we'll do this one. Do that. Why don't we do the alpha this time? Yeah. All right, slap that thing into a ring. See what you come up with. Actually, kind of the same way here. A little bit different though. We got a little keto action happening here. This is gonna be carbon number 1. This will be carbon number 2. That will be carbon 3, 4, 5, and 6. So we still got 6 carbons happening, but we do have the ketone group instead. We can still do the same thing. So if we want to kind of dump it on its side, we will end up with something that looks like this, I think. I'll just go that way. 3, 4, 5, and 6 here, I think. All right, so we got carbon 1, carbon 2, carbon 3, carbon 4, carbon 5, and carbon 6. Same idea. Everybody to the right there is going to go down. That means really at carbon 3 there, I have a H and an OH. Carbon 4, I got me an H and an OH. And carbon number 5, I got me an OH and an H. Did I go backwards there?
I think the hydrogen should be on the same side as the double bond.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter. It's okay. The double bonded oxygen, yeah, it's okay. Because we're not going to really do anything with the double bonded oxygen. So as long as the hydrogen and the OHs end up on sort of the right side, it'll be okay. All right, so we are going to get number 5 here. That is going to actually end up not at number 1 because that's not the carbon oxygen double bond. It's going to end up there, right, at carbon number 2, because that's where pretty much all the action is going to happen here. So remember, it's always going to attack sort of the carbonyl carbon or the carbon oxygen double bond. And in the case of a ketone, it's going to be actually 1 in, right, because it's not going to be at the end like it is with our aldo. That's going to be a kind of important because now if we're looking for what number ring we should draw, that's 1 carbon, 2 carbons, 3 carbons, and 4 carbons. So we actually should use the 4 carbon ring here, which is the one that kind of looks like cyclopentane with the oxygen in it. So that is actually the ring that we want to draw here. I'm going to try to draw it there, not too terribly here. We'll go this way. There we go. Right there. What we also see is in this particular case, like normal, we have our guy over here that is not part of the ring, but we also have the first guy over here as well that is not part of the ring as well. So both of those carbons are actually not going to be incorporated into the ring. They're going to be kind of hanging off of the ring. So we do know that we should always start with that number 6 guy or that last guy to the left of the oxygen, and we do the same thing. So that's going to be our CH2OH, and that's going to be carbon number 6. We're still going to number like we did before, which means this would be 5. That would be 4. That would be 3. That would be 2. And as we just talked about, our number 1 is actually off the ring. So it's not part of the ring in this case. Any questions on that there? Now, the rest of the movement here is pretty much the same thing as we did previously. We're going to skip number 5 because, again, that's where the ring kind of comes together and closes up shop. We're going to go to number 4 there, and we see the OH group is up, so we'll draw the OH group up. We go to number 3 there. We also see the OH group is up. And now, really at number 2, it's our last one on the ring, and that's really where our alpha or beta OH go. And in this case, it's alpha, which means my OH should go which way? Should go down. Right. But now I'm still missing one part of this, which is the first carbon, and that actually ends up on the other end of this guy, which is off of the ring. And that would be carbon number 1 right there. Yeah. So in this case, we actually do end up with 2 of those guys off of the ring. And unlike normal at the end there, where we do the alpha or beta, on the other end is the hydrogen. In this case, actually the carbon that's going to be there in that case. Question on that. Yeah, typically that one usually will always go up to the left of the oxygen in the ring. So always going upwards on that one above the ring. Yeah. Other questions? All right, so clear you need to be able to draw it from like the straight chain into the ring chain. Dare I do it? I will do it. Why not? Let's say we had the ring and we wanted to open it up. Yeah. And I know it's crazy talk at this late hour to try to do something like that. But let me just draw a crazy ring here. I suppose it's a rando ring. We'll just do that here. Let's just do that. All right, so I just drew that thing, whatever it is there. I want to open this guy up and just draw it straight because, you know, my ring's going to pop open at some point, maybe. All right, so how do we go about doing that? Well, we should kind of go about doing it the same way as we just kind of did the other ones and think about it that way. So the first thing I'm going to actually do is I'm going to number everything. And I know the guy up here should probably be carbon number 6. And that's going to be 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So I clearly know I got me a 6 carbons type thing happening here, right? So why not draw 6 carbons? And let's say I want to draw the D in this case. So I'm going to go 6 carbons here. 1, 2, 3. I'll just draw the carbons so you can see them. 4, 5, and 6 there. Well, clearly we know 6 is that guy right there. So we'll do a CH2OH. So I'm halfway there. If you had to take a venture of a guess, would this be an aldo or a keto? It would be an aldo. How do you know it would be an aldo? There's not another carbon group like we just saw in the previous example we just did, right? When we had a keto group, right? We had another carbon group hanging off the ring over there, which we do not see here. So it's probably a safe bet in this case that it's an aldo group there at the top. Otherwise, you would see some type of carbon group, right? And if you don't see that carbon group, that means that probably the carbon-oxygen double bonds at the end in that aldo group, right? Because that's where it kind of closes up on. So that is really the big thing here. We don't see anything here really in terms of carbons. And that would tell us that we could probably safely pop our aldehyde group up here on top, right? Now we got some places to number. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, right? So we actually do kind of the same thing, which is when we take our straight guy here and we drop it on its side, everybody on the right ends up down, right? And everybody on the left ends up, right? In terms of the OHs. So we could use that logic going the other way, which means when I go to carbon number 2, my OH group is up, which means it originally started left. So there's an OH. Oh, that's looking nice. My OH group here on number 3 is up as well, which means left. My OH group there on number 4 is down, which means it started on the right. That leaves carbon number 5. I want to draw D, which means it should end up on the right. Yeah. And much like they tell you to draw alpha or beta, you would be told to draw D or L, which would much like what we do with the alpha or beta, the last guy on the right there. Here, the D or L will tell you pretty much the last chirocarbon, which way it should go, left or right. And there we go. We just opened the ring up there. Yeah. Any questions on that there? All right. Well, I did one. You could do one now. Let's see. All right. Why don't you open up? Yeah, why don't you open up this ring here that I'm just gonna make up and draw. Dun, 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 dun. Dun, 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 dun. And why don't you open up this one as well? And I'll tell you which one to draw in just a second. I go OH. Let's do L for this guy, and we'll do D for this guy. And actually, I'm gonna fix my guy here. Actually, we'll do that one. Got a little carbon crazy. Okay, so let's take a look and see how we're doing. We'll start on the left here. Again, you might want to just start by counting how many carbons you got going on. So that's a carbon, obviously. That's 1. There's 2. There's 3. There's 4. There's actually only 5 carbons in this case, right? I didn't draw anything off of the ring in this case, so there's actually only 5 carbons. That would mean actually this guy's number 5 in that case, right? 4, 3, 2, and 1. And that means I could do my 5 in a row here if you want, or you could use just the straight lines if you like. That's going to be my 5th carbon there on the bottom. And aldehyde, ketone, what we got on this one? It is, yeah, still an aldehyde. Once again, we don't have any carbons hanging off of there, which means we got to have that aldehyde group there at carbon number 1 here. 2, 3, 4. And once again, we're going to kind of roll through at number 2. My OH is up, which means it had to start on the left there. My OH on number 3 is down, which means when I dropped it on the side, it was on the right-hand side. And at number 4 in this case, where everything comes together, that's going to be determined by L, which means I should put my OH group on the left-hand side. Yeah. There we go. We just opened it up there. Any questions on that one? All right, we'll come to this one here where I got a little overexcited with carbons, but we'll count. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 as well. So we're going to have another 6 here. 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, which, as we know, this will then be carbon number 6, and then we can number 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Once again, going to be an aldehyde group up on top. At carbon number 2, we're going down, which means OH group should be to the right. Carbon number 3 is going up, which means the OH group should be to the left. Carbon number 4, the OH group is going up, which means it should be to the left. And in this case, our last one there where it came together is going to be D, and that's going to be a right-hand side there. Yes. Any questions on how to open them up? Put them together in a ring. Fun with carbohydrates. Yes. All right. We will lay it up there as I see the look of stop, please.